What if the most terrifying weapon in human history had never been built? No blinding flash, no mushroom cloud, no cities erased in seconds, no nuclear age, and maybe no permanent fear hanging over humanity for the last 80 years. But then comes the darker question. If one man had refused to build the atomic bomb, would the world have become safer? Or would it have become even more dangerous? Because this is not just the story of a weapon. This is the story of a mind, so brilliant that it helped unlock the destructive power hidden inside the universe itself. And once that door was opened, humanity could never close it again. He was not a soldier. He was not a king. He was not even a politician. He was a physicist, a thinker, a dreamer of invisible worlds. And yet his work would help reshape war, politics, fear, and the future of civilization forever. This is the story of J. Robert Oppenheimer. And tonight, we ask the question that history can never truly answer. What if Oppenheimer had never built the atomic bomb? Before he became the face of the atomic age, Oppenheimer was a man of ideas. Not ordinary ideas. The kind that most people never even touch in their lifetime. He was fascinated by the invisible structure of reality itself, the hidden laws beneath matter, the strange mathematics beneath existence. While most people looked at the world and saw objects, men like Oppenheimer looked at the world and saw questions. And that is where this story truly begins. Because the atomic bomb was not born out of evil. It was born out of understanding, out of physics, out of curiosity, out of humanity's oldest intellectual hunger. To know what reality is really made of. And that is one of the deepest truths in all of science. The same mind that learns how stars burn can also learn how cities vanish. Science itself does not come with morality attached. It only opens doors. Humans decide what walks through them. And Oppenheimer was standing in front of one of the biggest doors in history. For most of human history, atoms were just theory, tiny invisible pieces of matter, too small to see, too small to imagine clearly. But by the early 20th century, scientists were beginning to understand something shocking. The atom was not solid. It was not simple. And it was not quiet. Inside it was energy. Unimaginable energy. Energy locked inside matter itself. That idea changed everything. Because if that energy could be released, then human civilization would suddenly be holding a force far beyond gunpowder, cannons, or ordinary explosives. The universe had hidden a fire inside matter, and humanity was getting closer to stealing it. This was not just another invention. This was the moment science began touching something almost mythological, the ability to turn pure knowledge into godlike power. And once people realized that possibility existed, it was only a matter of time before someone tried to build it. Now, here is the part most people miss. The atomic bomb was not built in a calm world. It was built in a world already collapsing. World War II had turned the planet into a nightmare. Entire nations were burning. Millions were dying. And somewhere in the background, a terrifying possibility began to spread among scientists and governments alike. What if Nazi Germany built the bomb first? That fear changed everything. Because once an idea becomes militarily possible, it no longer stays inside laboratories. It enters politics. It enters war. it enters survival. And when survival is involved, human morality becomes very unstable. This is where Oppenheimer's story becomes so psychologically important, because people often imagine evil choices as obvious, but history is much darker than that. Some of the most dangerous decisions in human history were made not by monsters, but by intelligent people under pressure, convinced they were preventing something even worse. That is how many catastrophic systems begin, not with madness, but with fear. In 1942, the United States launched one of the most secret and ambitious scientific operations ever attempted, the Manhattan Project. Its purpose was terrifyingly simple: build the atomic bomb before anyone else. And to lead the scientific effort, they chose Oppenheimer. Not because he was the most famous, not because he was the most politically powerful, but because he had something rare: the ability to understand not just isolated pieces of physics, but the whole terrifying machine. At Los Alamos, in the deserts of New Mexico, some of the brightest minds on Earth were gathered in secrecy. Physicists, engineers, chemists, mathematicians, all working toward one impossible goal: to create a weapon the world had never seen. And what makes this story so haunting is that many of them knew exactly what they were doing. This was not accidental. This was not ignorance. This was genius, organized toward destruction. And that is one of the most uncomfortable truths in modern history. Human intelligence does not automatically lead to wisdom. Sometimes it simply makes our consequences larger. Only weeks later, the bomb was no longer just a test. It became history. Hiroshima, then Nagasaki. 2 cities, 2 explosions. A level of destruction the human mind had never been forced to process before. And from that point onward, the atomic bomb was no longer just a military object. It became a symbol of modern power, modern fear, modern civilization's ability to destroy itself. This is the point where the question becomes unbearable. If Oppenheimer had never built the bomb, would those cities have been spared? Maybe, but history is rarely that simple. Because if one nation did not build it first, another might have. And that is the cruel logic of technological history. Once something is scientifically possible, it begins pulling civilization towards itself. Not always immediately, and that eventually the deeper tragedy may not be that Oppenheimer existed. The deeper tragedy may be that the atomic bomb became possible at all. Only weeks later, the bomb was no longer just a test. It became history. Hiroshima, then Nagasaki. 2 cities, 2 explosions. A level of destruction the human mind had never been forced to process before. And from that point onward, the atomic bomb was no longer just a military object. It became a symbol of modern power, modern fear, modern civilization's ability to destroy itself. This is the point where the question becomes unbearable. If Oppenheimer had never built the bomb, would those cities have been spared? Maybe, but history is rarely that simple. Because if one nation did not build it first, another might have. And that is the cruel logic of technological history. Once something is scientifically possible, it begins pulling civilization towards itself. Not always immediately, but eventually. And that means the deeper tragedy may not be that Oppenheimer existed. The deeper tragedy may be that the atomic bomb became possible at all. So let's ask the question directly. What if Oppenheimer had refused? What if he had looked at the project, looked at the science, looked at the future, and simply said, no? Would history have changed? Possibly, but maybe not in the way people imagine. Because Oppenheimer was not acting alone. He was part of a much larger machine. Governments, military command, war urgency, global fear, scientific momentum. If he had walked away, someone else may have stepped in. Maybe slower, maybe less effectively, but likely still eventually. And that reveals a hidden truth most people miss. History is not always driven by individuals alone.
Sometimes individuals become the face of forces that were already moving beneath civilization. In other words, Oppenheimer mattered, but the age itself was also pushing toward the bomb. That does not erase his responsibility, but it does make the story more disturbing, because it means the problem was not just one man, it was the entire structure of modern humanity, a species intelligent enough to discover everything before becoming wise enough to control itself. This is the part people are most drawn to. Did Oppenheimer regret it? The honest answer is yes, but regret in history is rarely clean. It is not always dramatic. It is not always loud. Sometimes regret looks like silence, like heaviness, like carrying something that can never be put down again. Oppenheimer later opposed aspects of further nuclear escalation, including the hydrogen bomb debate. He was no longer just a physicist solving equations. He had become a man haunted by what knowledge had done once it entered power. And maybe that's the most human part of this entire story. Because genius often imagines the breakthrough, but not always the world that comes after it. And once the world changes, you don't get to rewind it. That is why Oppenheimer's life feels less like a victory story and more like a warning. So now we return to the hardest question of all. Would the world actually be better if Oppenheimer had never built the atomic bomb? Emotionally, most people want to say yes, and morally, that instinct makes sense. But history is cruelly complicated, because some argue that nuclear weapons also prevented larger wars between major powers through fear of mutual destruction, a horrifying kind of peace, a peace built not on wisdom, but on terror. So perhaps the real answer is this: the world without the atomic bomb might have been less traumatized, or it might have found a different road to catastrophe. We cannot know for sure, and maybe that uncertainty is exactly what makes this story so haunting, because it forces us to confront something deeply uncomfortable. Not every scientific breakthrough creates a cleaner future. Some simply create a more dangerous one. And that brings us to the real lesson Oppenheimer left behind. This story is not just about war. It is about human nature. Because people often assume progress is automatically good, that if we can build something, we probably should. But history says otherwise. Progress without wisdom is not progress, it's acceleration. And acceleration without moral depth can become catastrophe. That is the deeper psychological truth behind Oppenheimer's story. Human beings are incredibly good at unlocking power, and painfully slow at learning how to live with it. That was true in 1945, and it may still be true now. So perhaps the most important question is not, could Oppenheimer have stopped the bomb? But rather, what are we building today that future generations may wish we had never created? That is where this story stops being history and starts becoming a mirror. In the end, Oppenheimer did not simply help build a weapon. He helped reveal something terrifying about the human species, that we are capable of understanding the stars while still struggling to govern the darkness inside ourselves. And maybe that's the real legacy of the atomic bomb. Not just destruction, but revelation. A revelation that science can give us unimaginable power without giving us the wisdom to survive it. And that leaves us with one final haunting thought. The greatest danger in history may never have been the bomb itself, but the mind that is brilliant enough to build one before it is wise enough to say no.